Let's just bow our heads as we ask the Lord to bless us as we worship together. Father in heaven, we come into thy presence to thank thee for thy goodness toward us. We thank thee for the messages that we have in thy word. We ask that thou open our minds and our hearts that we may understand more clearly that which you have for us. Bless us, we pray, for Jesus' sake. I read the statement last night that goes something like this. That's what happens, you see, when you get a little older. You sometimes forget. But the statement is that as an educator, no part of the Bible is of greater value than its biographies. As an educator, no part of the Bible is of greater value than its biographies. That's taken from Education, page 254. And there's great inspiration to be found in the lives of godly men, the lives recorded here. I've entitled this sermon, Old, Cold, and Bold. Well, we'll deal with the old first. The year was around 538 BC, and the Medes and the Persians had just recently conquered Babylon. And there were questions in the minds of the people that were captive, the Jews particularly, as to what would happen to them. To their surprise, Darius the Mede, the first king of Media Persia, decided to restructure the whole government and rearrange it. And he set up 120 provinces with governors over them and 3 presidents over those governors to, for accountability. Darius thought to make Daniel the chief of these 3 presidents. He would be the number 1 man. But why? Why would he choose a captive, slave, Jew to be the chief of his 3 presidents? His citizens must have thought, what's wrong with this old man? He was 62. Maybe he's losing his marbles. He's not quite right. How can he choose? And an old man at that, Daniel was now around 88, thereabouts. Why would he choose Daniel? But Daniel 6 tells you the reason why. Daniel 6. Verse 3, then Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes because an excellent spirit was found in him. And 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 30 says, them that honor me, I will honor. Let's go to the Bible. I want to delve a little more deeply into this chapter. Chapter 6 of Daniel. We'll stay in that chapter for the best part of this discussion this morning. There's so much more than just a surface read. When we think of Daniel, we associate him with empires, dreams, beasts, prophecies. Adventist Church really is very strong in Daniel and the Revelation. And we think of him, when we first mention the word Daniel, that's what comes to your mind. The beasts of the dreams and the prophecies. But when we look a little closer, we find in chapter 6 this experience of Daniel Psalms 92, verse 12 to 14 says that the old aged will still bear fruit in their old age, and they will stay fresh and green. Now, Daniel was not your ordinary octogenarian. He had a spring in his step. And he was highly valued in the empire, in spite of the fact that he was the top man in the previous government, previous empire that had been conquered. In Western society, we generally, unfortunately, we do not value our older folk as we should. When I went to China, when I toured with a band, went to China, I found a different attitude toward their old folk there. They venerate them, and when a person turns 70, the whole village will come around and honor this man who has now become a sage, a wise man. In Western society, they're often treated badly and treated as though they are of no more use to society. That's a pity. But it's interesting that Leviticus has something to say, and we can take notice of that. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 32, has this to say. Chapter 19, verse 32. Thou shalt rise up before the hoary head and honor the face of the old man and fear thy God. I am the Lord. That's a commandment from God. When we show disrespect in any form to the older folks, we're in great danger. The Lord has given us that command to honor the head, the hoary head, and the face of the old man. You know, sometimes you look at the TV and there's always adverts of cosmetics and trying to get rid of the wrinkles. I want to tell you that don't worry about them. They are the stripes that you earned in the hard battles of life. You've earned your stripes. So don't worry about the wrinkles. They're your stripes. Well earned in the hard battles of life. Treasure your old folk, honor them and love them, for they sometimes get lonely. But I'm digressing here. Let's get back to Daniel. Here he was, about 88 or thereabouts, a captive in a foreign land, and for 70 years against his will. Yet he flourished right where he was planted, and like Joseph, he was successful. Now you know Satan never sleeps. There's no rest for the wicked, and he's always on the lookout for an opportunity to destroy anybody who chooses to serve God. And when you look at verse 4, it says, then the presidents and the princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no occasion, nor fault, for as much as he was faithful. Neither was there any error or fault in him. That's a high recommendation from your enemies. That's a high recommendation. He was faithful, incorruptible, honest, no error in him. Well, we need leaders in the church like that. We need leaders in our nation like that. Imagine what a great nation this could be if we had men and women like that. No, we won't find anything against him. They searched, they scrutinized, they watched him. No, we won't find anything, except Daniel had one flaw. You know what that was? He was so utterly predictable. Utterly predictable. He did the same thing every day for 70 years of captivity. I mean, every day. For him, nothing had changed. He was one way as a young man. He was the same way as a middle-aged man. He was the same way as an old man. He was faithful in his duties. He was faultless in his character, and he was fervent in his prayers. And that's what got him into trouble. You know, sometimes we think that everything will go right. You see, doing right is no guarantee that things will go smoothly. Why? Because the devil is always on your track. And Daniel got into trouble for not for doing wrong, but for doing right. You know, an 88-year-old habit is hard to break. It's hard to break that kind of habit we've had for 88 years. Morning, noon, and night, Daniel prayed. Morning, noon, and night, Daniel prayed. When he went on business trips for the king, morning, noon, and night, Daniel prayed. I wonder if we could stand that kind of scrutiny in our work, our business deals, our tax returns, our vocabulary at home when nobody sees, what we watch, what we listen to. Could we stand that kind of scrutiny? They watched him. These are personal questions you have to deal with. What are you when nobody's looking? No, we'll never find anything against him except we find it against the law of his God. Now, verse 6 to 8, I want you to look at that. Then came the presidents and the princes assembled together to the king, and they said unto him, King Darius, live forever. Now, in the margin it says, they came tumultuously, as though they had some urgent business which would benefit the kingdom. And they put the proposition to him, how would you like to be God for a whole month? No one must ask of any petition to any man or God except to you, O king. So he would virtually be seen as God. Well, Darius thinks that sounds okay to me. Not realizing the snare and the trap that has been set for this man. And with the law also goes a death decree. They were desperate to get rid of Daniel, all right? And the law suspends religious liberty for a whole month. Gone. Religious liberty is gone for a whole month. But how did they know they could trap him like that? His consistent prayer life. That's how. When they passed his house, going to their business, what do you think they found him doing at noon? Morning, noon, night. Daniel was predictable. They could set their clock by him. He took time off from his busy schedule as the top man in the kingdom to go home and to pray. And to pray morning, noon, and night. Daniel's priority was prayer. Daniel is now faced with a test of loyalties. He was a loyal subject to the king, and yet he knew that the King of Kings deserved a higher loyalty. Daniel's first obligation was to God. It's yours as well. Not your employer, not even your family. He had a special time every day and a special place for his appointment with his Maker. But why toward Jerusalem, the text says? Now, I want you to just go to 1 Kings chapter 8, and you'll see something. 1 Kings chapter 8. Solomon is praying. And in his prayer, I won't read the whole of it, but if you scan it, you'll see there that 7 times Solomon has asked God to answer the prayers of his people when they are in trouble or in captivity or wherever they are. 7 times he's asked God to answer their prayer and deliver them. We do well to follow that example, to keep Christ as the focus. He had the temple and God, the worship of God, as his focus, and he prayed toward Jerusalem. Now notice 3 things in that chapter 2. In chapter 6, again we go back to Daniel. There is something there. 3 things. There's humility. He kneeled down and prayed. There is regularity every day. And there is worship. Now, he gave thanks to God just as he had done before, as he had always done. If you read that chapter in Daniel again. He gave thanks as his custom was. What about you and me? How is your prayer life? Sometimes, even those who observe false religions show more devotion than we do. Sometimes. Notice something else. Daniel did not ask God for deliverance. He prayed and gave thanks to God. He knew what the consequences would be. He knew what the writing was, that there was a death decree. Now, Daniel had served God faithfully from his youth, and he certainly wasn't going to change now. 70 years, just figure this out, 70 years of captivity. 3 times a day he prayed. That's 75,000 prayers. That's besides the times when he had special petitions of God, like when he asked for enlightenment for Nebuchadnezzar's dream and such occasions. Is your prayer life as good as that? We should make it a practice. At least twice a day. Sometimes we don't even do that. You see, for Daniel, it was more dangerous not to pray to his God, as his custom was, than to go into a den of hungry lions. 30 days without prayer. Totally unthinkable. Totally unthinkable. Somebody said, 7 days without prayer makes 1 week. W-E-A-K. 7 days without prayer makes 1 week. And that's true, spiritually. Could you go 30 days without prayer? What if you were threatened with a death decree? Could you observe the Sabbath when the death decree goes forth? What would Daniel do if company came around to his house and there were non-Sabbath keepers? Would he suspend his Sabbath-keeping duties to be with them? Would he stay away? I don't believe Daniel would suspend his religion for anybody. And nor should we. No matter what our friends may think. Now it gets serious. Now it gets serious. Because his enemies watch to see whether he will become a criminal. His enemies are watching now to see if he will become a criminal. You see, not all crimes are sins. And not all sins are crimes. Now let me illustrate to you. Is it a sin to have other gods? Yes. Is it a crime? No. Is it a sin to worship graven images? Yes. Is it a crime? No. Is it a sin to take God's name in vain? Yes. Is it a crime? No. Is it a sin to covet? Yes. Is it a crime? No. Is it a sin to steal and to kill? Yes. And it's also a crime. I think you see my point. So now they watch to see if he will become a criminal. See, only God can make a law that if we break it, we become a sinner. We sin. And man makes laws that when we break them, we become criminals. You see? So now they're watching for at least a day, and they come to the king and remind him of his decree, which could not be changed, the law of the Medes and the Persians. Now they come and remind the king that Daniel, that slave, that captive, you've made him, but he doesn't regard your laws. They remind him, and the king was so displeased with himself. You remember the incident with Haman and Queen Esther? The law that couldn't be changed? And now the king thinks to himself, how could I have allowed myself and to be fooled by my princes? He had grown fond of Daniel. Daniel was his friend. How could I have allowed myself to be duped? Notice the irony. If he was God for a day, why couldn't he change the law? Why? If he was God for a day. But no, the law cannot be changed according to those that accuse Daniel. Now his friend Daniel is under sentence of death, not because he sinned, but according to their law, he had become a criminal. Now verse 14 tells you something there. The king strove to do what? He strove to free Daniel, to find some way of getting him out. He probably consulted the best lawyers in his kingdom to try and free Daniel. But no avail. And so the sentence must be carried out. And Daniel, the faultless, upright servant of God, is thrown into the den of lions. But notice the king's words in verse 16. Then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the lion's den. And the king spake and said unto Daniel, thy God whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. Well, this is most interesting. The king, pagan king, mark you, tells Daniel that his God will deliver him. That's notable when you think about it. And then when you look at verse 18, it's even more impressive. Here is a most interesting and remarkable thing, for here we have a pagan king spending the night fasting and probably praying for the deliverance from lions of a person who served a different God from him. How about that? There is a lot to like about Darius. It's a sleepless night for the king. But there's a personal question right there. When last did you spend the night fasting and praying for deliverance over some lion in your character? We all have them. The devil goes about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. And sometimes, as Matthew 17, verse 21, when the disciples, when the person was brought there, the father brought his child to Jesus because the disciples were not able to cure the boy that was demon-possessed. And they asked Jesus, why couldn't we do this? You had given us power. And Jesus said, this kind cometh not forth except by prayer and by fasting. Oh, the lions were roaring all right. But when Daniel was lowered into the den, everything went deathly quiet. Now, you know, old folks don't stand the cold very well. And there was no heating in the lion's den. So Daniel, although he was old, he was now cold in the lion's den. And he was 88 years old. Yes, he was old, and he was cold, but he was bold for the God he served. Now, notice something else. God did not prevent him from his enemies from casting him to the lion's den. And you know, so often we hear preachers, many TV preachers saying that if you give your money to the church or you serve the Lord, everything will be fine. Not so. You only have to look at Daniel's experience. God did not prevent Daniel's enemies from carrying out their plot against him. Remember the 3 Hebrew boys? God did not prevent them from being thrown into the fire. Remember Joseph? God did not prevent him from becoming a slave, even being falsely accused. But Satan, as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour, goes about. Somehow I think that Daniel spent a better night in the lion's den with the angel than Darius did. His sleep went from him, it says. And I can imagine him spending the night fasting and worrying and possibly praying to the God, as he said, the living God. And at the crack of dawn, the king is up and he's in a hurry. He's in a hurry. He has spent the night in fasting and prayer, and he wants to see whether his prayer has been answered. How about that? He wants to see if his own prayer, his petition, in his own way to the living God has been answered, and the God of Daniel has preserved him. So look at verse 20. It says he comes down to the lion's den and he cries out with a lamentable voice, as if he's not quite convinced that God would save him. He cries out with a lamentable voice, "Oh, Daniel." That's verse 20. "Oh, Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God whom thou servest continually able to deliver thee from the lions?" There's a moment of silence, and then a voice comes wafting up from the lion's den. "O King, live forever. My God hath sent his angel and hath shut the lion's mouth, that they have not hurt me. For as much, and listen to the gentle rebuke of Daniel to the king, for as much as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. There's a gentle rebuke to the king as well, that he had done nothing wrong. I imagine that as they take Daniel out of the pit, the king checks him out to see whether there's any harm to him. He probably hugs him for joy. This is his friend. He is delivered from the lion's den because he trusted in his God. And if God can deliver Daniel from the den of lions, he can deliver you from whatever lion is stalking you. Whether it is a bad habit or alcohol, tobacco, bad temper even, my God is able to deliver you. But wait, there's more to the story. The story does not end there, because Daniel's enemies are standing by, and they probably, cynical, say, oh, well, perhaps the lions weren't hungry. Or perhaps somebody sneaked them some food during the night. Well, let's put that theory to the test. Verse 24 tells you what the result was. You see, in Deuteronomy 19, verse 16 to 19, let's just look at that for a moment. Deuteronomy 19, verse 16 to 19. It says, if a false witness rise up against any man to testify against him that which is wrong, then both the men between them whom the controversy, it shall stand before the Lord, before the priests and the judges, which shall be in those days. And the judges shall make diligent inquisition. And behold, if the witness is a false witness, and he hath testified falsely against his brother, then shall ye do unto him as he thought to have done to his brother. So shalt thou put evil away from you, among you. So, they thought to do evil to Daniel. The modern day, they say, oh, that's karma. No such thing. But you do reap what you sow. And perhaps they were skeptical about the lions. Perhaps they weren't hungry. Well, let's put that theory to the test. And verse 24 tells you exactly what happens to them. And the king commanded, and they brought those men which had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them with their children, their wives, and the lions had the mastery over them, and break all their bones in pieces before they even came to the bottom of the den. It sounds harsh to us. But Darius got some information from that very event. And that was that these men, his princes, his governors that he had appointed, could not be trusted. They could not be trusted if they could do something like that, work a scheme like that to deceive him and to put the man that he had put in charge into such danger. Many times we do not realize, and many times I've heard TV presenters mock at people who believe in the intervention of God in the affairs of men. And they try to explain it away by some so-called scientific reason. But God does intervene, and I'm about to show you that. Although he didn't intervene and stop what happened, would we be still preaching about this if Daniel had been eaten by the lions? I think we would. You think about it. The point here is not just the deliverance. The point here is that Daniel, even while God didn't deliver Abel from Cain, or John the Baptist, or Stephen, or many other martyrs throughout the ages, God did not even deliver Jesus, and even though he prayed 3 times in Gethsemane, Father, if this cup may not pass from thee except I drink it. But they were all winners. All those who place God first and honor him above everything else may suffer, they may die, they may go bankrupt, they may suffer loss, but they are all winners. If the God of the universe is their God, never forget it. God will ultimately deliver his people, sometimes now, sometimes later. But he will, and God's people will win out, regardless of what happens. Don't ever give up on God. He won't give up on you. I wonder what really happened that night in the awful den of lions. Would you like to know? I thought about this for a long time. And I had speculations. And I'm thinking in my imagination, this is what I thought. I thought, well, you know, God sometimes talks to the creatures that he has created. Remember Noah's Ark? The animals were directed. God spoke to them. 2 by 2, they went in an orderly fashion. Remember God commanded the ravens to feed Elijah? Now, you know, if you think about that a little bit, Elijah must have questioned, Lord, but surely, you know, the raven is an unclean bird, is a scavenger. And he brought him bread and flesh night and morning. Were those pieces of flesh nicely cut up into nice edible pieces and the bread? But you know, God supplies his need. Every day, bread and flesh. But there was enough for each day. God spoke to the whale. He said to the whale, I want you to go to a certain place. I want you to pick up Jonah. He's going in the wrong direction. I want you to take him to the place where I sent him. And these are the coordinates. You'll find him there just near the ship. Pick him up and take him to where I wanted him to go. Deliver him there because he's going to the wrong place. Remember Balaam? 3 times the donkey, the ass had more sense than the man. 3 times the donkey stopped. He wouldn't go any further because he saw the angel. I think Balaam made a greater ass of himself than the ass he was riding on. I like to think that God spoke to the lions that night and said, listen, you kittens, I want you to be careful. Tonight I'm sending one of my old friends down here to visit you. I want you to not hurt a hair of his head. I want you to be gentle with him because I want to show a pagan king who is the true God. And I'm doing it by sending my friend down here to spend the night with you. So be gentle with him. I have a poem here that I'd like to read. I picked this up some time back. They weren't allowed to bite. Daniel stood in the lion's den, but he wasn't the least afraid, for God had closed the lion's mouth. He heard when Daniel prayed. But I think he heard the lions growl from mouths that God had shut tight. They looked at him with their hungry eyes, but they weren't allowed to bite. All night long they paced the den on their great big feet. They were starved and the food was there, but they weren't allowed to eat. The saliva dripped from their hungry mouths and their stomachs hurt all night. They looked at him with their hungry eyes, but they weren't allowed to bite. Daniel prayed in the lion's den. He prayed the whole night through, and just as soon as it was light, the king came down there too, and Daniel cried, "An angel bright closed the lion's mouth last night." They looked at me with their hungry eyes, but they weren't allowed to bite. The king was glad and the king rejoiced when he heard what Daniel said. He ordered all those wicked to be thrown into the den instead. The lions leaped and the lions roared, and it was an awful sight. For God had opened the lions' mouths, and they were allowed to bite. And this last verse comes down to our time. The Bible says that the time will come when I'll stand in the lion's den. The world will be the den I'm in, and the lions will all be men. And they will try to destroy the children of God. They will hunt for them day and night. They will look at me with hungry eyes, but they won't be allowed to bite. Notice the end of the story in the verse 25 to 28. A pagan king now becomes the second world kingdom leader to propagate the news of the true God. The king spreads the gospel to all the then known world. And what about Daniel? Well, he prospered in the reign of not only Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, but also in the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. You know, if we will honor and obey him, God will honor us. And he is able to take a man who is a slave and honor him as he did Daniel and Joseph. Let's wrap this up. 5 lessons for modern day Daniels. It is possible to live a pure life in the midst of a pagan world. Daniel's story shows that if you purpose in your heart to serve God, you can do it even in a secular society like ours. 2, Christians who live for God should expect opposition. We have to face the fact that not everyone shares our faith and go on from there. This is part of what Jesus meant when he said, "Take up your cross daily and follow him." 3, God can use us to touch unlikely people if we are faithful. And Daniel's life and integrity had a powerful impact on Darius, who became the second pagan king to proclaim the God of heaven to be the true God. 4, Daniel is able to deliver his people from any danger that they face. If God can deliver Daniel from the lion's den and the Hebrew boys from a fiery furnace, he can deliver you from whatever is troubling you at the moment. 5, God always delivers in his own time and way. God always delivers his people in his own time and way. Even Nebuchadnezzar had to admit that everything this living God does is right. The challenge to us is to be dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone, dare to have a purpose firm, and dare to make it known. In closing, let's sing this beautiful old hymn found in the old hymn book. Dare to be a Daniel, standing by a purpose firm, heeding God's command. Honor them, the faithful few, all hail to Daniel's band. Dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone, dare to have a purpose firm, dare to make it known.